Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The GPS coordinates are still burned into my phone screen. 42.3671 degrees north, 86.5287 degrees west. I screenshot them before my battery died that night on Lake Michigan, before Captain Roy's boat went dark, before we learned why some waters should never be crossed, even when they look perfectly calm. If you're listening to this from the comfort of your bed right now, good, stay there. Pull those covers up tight. Because what I'm about to tell you is the reason why every charter captain from Milwaukee to Muskegon knows certain spots on that lake where the fish are plenty. But nobody ever drops anchor. They never tell the tourists about the rules, never mention the coordinates they mark with red X's on their personal charts. But I found out. And once you know, you can never unknow. Story begins now. My name's Jake Morrison. Last September, I was just another Chicago finance guy who thought a weekend fishing trip would clear my head after a brutal quarter. I'd booked Captain Roy Anderson through his website. Anderson Charters, 30 years on Lake Michigan. The reviews were stellar. 5 stars across the board. What the reviews didn't mention was the way Roy's hands would tighten on the wheel whenever we drifted too far west. That Friday morning was perfect. September in Wisconsin. The air had that crisp bite that makes you grateful for coffee. The harbor at Port Washington was already buzzing at 5 a.m. Other charters loading up tourists, all of us chasing salmon and trout in the deep waters. Roy's boat, the Madeline Marie, was a beauty. 42-foot Tiara sportfish. Twin diesels that purred like satisfied cats. Everything about it screamed professional, except for one thing. The fish finder had a piece of black electrical tape over certain parts of the screen. "What's with the tape?" I asked as we pulled away from the dock. Roy didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the horizon. Some depths. Better not to know. I laughed, thought he was playing up the mysterious captain routine for tips. "Come on, Roy. I'm paying good money here." He finally turned, and something in his weathered face made my smile fade. "Mr. Morrison, you ever wonder why Lake Michigan has more shipwrecks per square mile than any other Great Lake? Storms, right? November gales? That's what they tell people." He turned back to the wheel. "The lake takes what it wants, when it wants. Been that way since before the Potawatomi knew to avoid certain waters. We just follow the old rules now, stay in the safe lanes, fish where we're meant to fish." The morning went well enough. We trolled the usual spots off Port Washington. Caught 3 decent-sized salmon by 9 a.m. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Other boats dotted the horizon, all clustered in the same general areas. That's when I noticed it. There was this gap, this perfect circle of empty water about 2 miles off our port side. Prime fishing territory from what I could tell, but not a single boat anywhere near it. Why's nobody fishing there? I pointed toward the empty water. Roy's jaw clenched. That's outside the lanes. The lanes. Safe passages. Where we're allowed. Allowed by who? The Coast Guard? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, by the lake. I should have left it alone. Should have just enjoyed my salmon and headed back to shore like every other tourist. But I'd been watching the fish finder all morning, and I'd noticed something. Whenever we'd drift toward that empty zone, even slightly, the screen would light up like Times Square. Massive schools of fish, just sitting there, waiting. "Roy, there's enough fish over there to fill your boat twice over." "Probably. So why?" "Because I want to make it home to my grandkids, Mr. Morrison." His voice had an edge now, sharp, final. Some things are worth more than money. But money, that's all I thought about back then. The calculations were already running through my head. If we could pull in that kind of haul, word would spread. Roy could charge premium prices. I could invest, maybe buy into the charter business myself. "I'll pay triple," I heard myself say. Roy's hands went white on the wheel. "Triple your day rate, cash, just 20 minutes in that spot." "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm asking to fish in empty water." What's the worst that could happen? He turned to look at me then. Really look at me. His blue eyes had that 1,000-yard stare you see in war veterans. "The worst? Son, the lake doesn't take kindly to trespassers. There are things down there. Things that were here before the glaciers carved out these waters, before the first ship ever sailed. And they have rules." "You're seriously trying to tell me you believe in lake monsters?" "No." He turned back to the wheel. "I'm telling you, I've been on this lake for 30 years. I've seen boats go out full of experienced sailors and come back empty, if they come back at all. I've watched the Coast Guard classify things as equipment failure that no equipment could cause. And I've learned that when every captain from here to Traverse City avoids certain coordinates, there's a damn good reason." I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app. 5,000. Cash. 20 minutes. The boat's engine dropped to an idle. We bobbed there in the gentle swells while Roy stared at that empty water. I could see him wrestling with it. The mortgage payments, the boat maintenance, the grandkids' college funds. 10 minutes, he finally said. We drop lines for 10 minutes. First sign of anything unusual, we leave. No arguments. Deal. He pulled out an old paper chart from under the console. Hand-drawn marks covered it, red X's, circles, notes in cramped handwriting. His finger traced a route to the empty zone, avoiding certain spots like they were minefields. "Listen close," he said. "We don't anchor. We keep the engines running. You don't lean over the sides. You don't put your hands in the water. And if I say we leave, understood?" I nodded, adrenaline already pumping. This was what I'd been missing in my cubicle life. Real adventure, real risk. Roy pulled the tape off a section of the fish finder. The screen immediately exploded with signals. Fish at every depth. So many the display could barely process it. It looked like an underwater city down there. "Jesus," I breathed. "Why aren't they moving?" "They're waiting," Roy muttered, pushing the throttle forward. "Everything down there is waiting." The water changed as we entered the empty zone. I don't mean the color or the waves. It was something else. Something that made my inner ear feel off balance. Like when you're on an elevator that stops too suddenly. The temperature dropped maybe 10 degrees in the span of 30 feet. But it was more than temperature. The very air seemed heavier, pressing against my chest like we were descending into some vast underwater cavern. My watch stopped ticking. The digital display flickered between numbers that couldn't be right, times that hadn't happened yet or had passed hours ago. Roy cut the engines to trolling speed. Lines in. Quick, I rigged up 2 poles with the biggest lures we had. The moment they hit the water, both rods nearly bent in half. Holy... I grabbed one, started reeling. The drag screamed. Whatever was on the other end felt massive, but wrong somehow. It wasn't fighting like a fish, more like dragging, like I'd hooked dead weight that occasionally remembered it was supposed to struggle. The resistance came in patterns. 3 strong pulls, pause, 3 pulls, pause, like Morse code transmitted through fishing line. My hands cramped from gripping the rod, but I couldn't let go. Something in my hindbrain was screaming that dropping the line would be the worst possible thing I could do. Roy watched the fish finder, his face pale. They're coming up. What? All of them, every depth, they're all coming up. The water around the boat began to churn. Not violently, but purposefully. Deliberate. Like something vast was slowly turning over beneath us. The churning moved in spirals, creating patterns in the foam that reminded me of something. Something I couldn't quite place, but that made my teeth ache to look at. My rod suddenly went slack. Line broke? No, Roy said quietly. It let go. That's when we saw them, the fish. Hundreds, maybe thousands, rising to the surface in perfect synchronization. Salmon, trout, perch, even sturgeon. All of them floating belly up in a perfect circle around the boat. Dead, every single one of them. Dead, but not recently dead. Their eyes were clouded, scales dulled, like they'd been floating for weeks, yet the water had been empty when we arrived. I watched one massive salmon drift past the boat, its mouth opening and closing in a rhythm that almost looked like speech. No sound came out, but I found myself trying to read its lips anyway. "Roy," my voice cracked. "They're an offering," he whispered, "to make us leave." An offering from what? The fish finder screen went black, then static, then something else. Shapes. Moving in patterns that didn't make sense. Massive forms at depths the screen shouldn't even be able to read. Geometric shadows that seemed aware of being watched. The static resolved into what looked like sonar readings, but wrong. Instead of simple ping responses, the screen showed complex waveforms that pulsed like heartbeats. Multiple heartbeats, dozens of them, all synchronized, all getting stronger. Roy lunged for the throttle. "We're leaving. Now," but the engines wouldn't start. That clicking sound of the ignition, over and over, but nothing. The boat's electrical system flickered. GPS died, radio static. Even my phone screen started glitching, showing coordinates that kept changing, numbers that shouldn't exist. "Manual override," Roy muttered, diving under the console. "Has to be." The dead fish began to sink, all at once, like something had pulled the drain plug on the lake. They disappeared into the dark water, leaving us in a perfect circle of empty, black glass. That's when I heard it. Tapping against the hull, rhythmic, deliberate. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. But there was a pattern within the pattern. The taps weren't random. They were following the same rhythm I'd felt through the fishing line. The same beat I'd noticed in the fish finder's pulse. Like the entire lake was keeping time to some vast underwater metronome. "Don't look over the side," Roy hissed from under the console. "Whatever you do, don't look." But I had to. You understand that, right? When every instinct in your prehistoric brain is screaming danger, you have to know what it is. You have to see the threat. I leaned over the port side. The water was clear. Impossibly clear. Like looking through air, I could see straight down, hundreds of feet, to where the light faded to black. And in that darkness, eyes. Massive. Unblinking. Arranged in patterns that hurt to process, not one creature, but many. Or maybe one creature with many parts. I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. They shifted and moved like a living kaleidoscope of flesh and scales and things that shouldn't exist. And they were looking back at me. Not just looking, studying, measuring, deciding. The worst part wasn't their size or their alien geometry. It was the intelligence behind them. Ancient, patient, amused, like discovering a child playing with toys it didn't understand. I felt my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Felt neurons firing in patterns they weren't designed for. Felt something fundamental about my understanding of reality beginning to crack. The tapping stopped. "Got it!" Roy shouted. The engines roared to life. He slammed the throttle forward so hard I nearly fell overboard. The boat lurched, hydroplaning almost, racing away from those coordinates like hell itself was chasing us. I scrambled for my phone, trying to screenshot the GPS before it died completely. 42.3671 degrees north, 86.5287 degrees west. We didn't speak until we saw other boats. Normal boats with normal people catching normal fish. Only then did Roy cut the speed back to normal. "What did you see?" he asked without looking at me. I don't know." "Good. Keep it that way. Some things, knowing makes it worse." My hands were shaking. "We have to report this. The Coast Guard, Marine Biology departments." "Report what?" Roy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That we saw some dead fish? That our engines stalled? Happens all the time on the lake. But those things, what things?" He finally looked at me. "You got proof? Photos? Videos? All you got is a story nobody will believe, and coordinates you'll wish you'd never saved." He was right. My phone was dead. The GoPro I'd brought had somehow been wiped clean. No footage, no photos, nothing. Like those 10 minutes had been erased from everything except our memories. "Why show me then?" I asked. "Why risk it?" Roy was quiet for a long moment. "Because guys like you don't listen to warnings. You hear don't and think, why not? You need to see it, feel it. Let that primal fear sink into your bones. So next time someone tells you there are rules, maybe you'll believe them." Has anyone ever gone back to study them? Sure, university team back in '92. 3 marine biologists with all the equipment you could want. They anchored right over those coordinates for a full day. What did they find? Nobody knows. Boat turned up 2 weeks later in Traverse Bay, 100 miles north. Everything working perfectly. Logs showed they'd never stopped recording. 12 hours of blank tape. And the team? He shrugged. Coast Guard found them floating off Sleeping Bear Dunes. All 3, holding hands in a circle. Been in the water for days, but... He paused. No decomposition. No water in their lungs. Just empty. Like something had reached inside and scooped out everything that made them human. I should have left it alone, but if you're still listening to this, still cozy in your bed, you know that feeling, that itch in your brain that won't go away. The need to understand, to categorize, to make sense of something that defies sense. I spent weeks researching old maritime records, Potawatomi legends, Coast Guard incident reports that got buried in bureaucracy, and patterns started emerging. 1,847. Schooner Phoenix reports unnatural congregation of deceased fish at specific coordinates before losing all hands. 1,891. Freight vessel Chicora logs. Massive subaqueous disturbance near same location. Ship found weeks later. Crew missing. 1923. Prohibition runners report eyes in the deep while smuggling Canadian whiskey. 3 boats vanish in one night. 1958. Commercial fishing vessel Margaret Ann pulls up nets filled with fish that were wrong somehow. Entire catch disposed of. Coordinates blacklisted by Fishing Union. 1976. Research submarine from Northwestern University experiences complete instrumentation failure and psychological distress at depth of 400 feet. Project abandoned, 1992, the incident Roy mentioned. 2003, recreational diver reports geometric patterns of bioluminescence that seemed aware, before suffering severe decompression despite following all protocols. 2017, drone submarine from Michigan Tech loses signal at those exact coordinates. When recovered, Its memory cards were blank, but the hull showed stress patterns consistent with massive pressure, at only 200 feet depth. The coordinates were always the same. Always that same empty circle on the lake where charter captains won't go. I became obsessed. Started reaching out to marine biologists, cryptozoologists, anyone who'd listen. Most thought I was crazy. But a few had heard whispers, stories passed down through maritime families, rules that didn't make sense but were followed anyway. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Great Lakes Research Institute finally agreed to meet me. Coffee shop in Milwaukee. She looked nervous, even being seen with me. "You went to the prohibited zone," she said. It wasn't a question. "Prohibited? There's nothing official." "Nothing official," she agreed. "But every research vessel on the lake has those coordinates programmed into their navigation systems as hazardous. Not restricted, not dangerous, hazardous. Do you understand the distinction?" "Not really." She leaned forward. "Restricted means humans decided it's off limits. Dangerous means there's a known threat. Hazardous." She paused. "Hazardous means we don't understand the threat well enough to classify it. So you know something's there. We know something happens there, regularly, predictably. The lake floor at those coordinates, it doesn't match any geological survey. It's deeper than it should be. The water temperature fluctuates in patterns that violate thermodynamics, and the biological density readings." She shook her head. "It's like looking at a city, but nothing should be able to survive at those pressures. So why not study it?" We tried. My predecessor, Dr. Marcus Webb, led a team in 2003, state-of-the-art equipment, full Coast Guard escort. They were going to finally map those anomalies. What happened? She pulled out her phone, showed me a photo. 5 people on a research vessel, all smiling, professional, confident. This was the team. 5 of the best freshwater researchers in the country. She swiped to the next photo. Same 5 people, but different. They were standing in the same positions, wearing the same clothes, but their faces empty. Not sad or traumatized, just vacant, like looking at mannequins. The boat never left sight of the Coast Guard escort. Never submerged anything deeper than standard equipment. But after 4 hours at those coordinates, this is what came back. All 5 researchers alive, physically healthy. But she put her phone away. They couldn't remember their own names. Couldn't remember why they were on a boat. Couldn't remember anything except one phrase they kept repeating. What phrase? The deep ones remember everything. My coffee had gone cold. What happened to them? Institutional care. Dr. Webb still thinks he's 5 years old. Dr. Martinez speaks in languages our linguistics department can't identify. The others, they just stare at walls. Drawing patterns. Always the same patterns. Geometries that... She stood to leave. I've said too much. Wait. The patterns. Can I see them? She hesitated at the door. Why would you want to? Because I've already seen them. In the water. In my dreams. Every night since I was on that boat. I see them. She came back, sat down slowly. Show me. I pulled out my notebook. Pages and pages of drawings I'd been making without thinking. Circles, ishas. Within circles, angles that connected in impossible ways. Shapes that seemed to move even on flat paper. Her face went white. These are exactly what they draw. All 5 of them, every day. The same patterns. She grabbed my hand. Listen to me very carefully. Those aren't random. They're coordinates. Not geographic, something else. Dimensional maybe, or temporal, we don't know. But everyone who's seen what's down there, they can't stop drawing them. Like something is trying to use human minds as as transmission towers, broadcasting a signal we don't understand. A signal to what? Or from what? She stood again. Stop looking into this. Delete those coordinates. Forget what you saw, and whatever you do, never go back. But I couldn't stop. The dreams were getting worse. Not nightmares exactly. More like memories that weren't mine. Ancient memories of when the lake wasn't a lake, when something else lived here. Something that never really left. 3 weeks ago, I went back. I know how stupid that sounds, but when you can't sleep, can't eat, can't think about anything except those eyes in the deep, you either go crazy or you go back. I didn't hire a charter this time. Bought a small boat. Nothing fancy, just enough to get me to those coordinates. I went at night. Don't ask me why. It just felt right. Like that's when I was supposed to be there. The lake was glass, no wind, no waves, just black water reflecting stars. I used my phone's GPS. Those same coordinates still burned into the screen. 42 degrees, 36.71 degrees north, 86 degrees, 52.87 degrees west. I knew I'd reached the spot before the GPS confirmed it. The temperature drop. The way sound seemed to die. The feeling of being watched by something vast and patient. I dropped anchor. The water was clear again. That impossible clarity that let me see straight down into absolute darkness. And in that darkness, movement, slow, deliberate, rising. Not the creatures this time. Something else. Geometric shapes, perfectly smooth. Made of something that wasn't quite metal, wasn't quite stone. They rose in formation. A city of impossible architecture ascending from depths that shouldn't exist in Lake Michigan. Towers that twisted in on themselves. Bridges that connected to nothing. Streets that led up and down simultaneously. And all of it covered in those patterns. The same ones I'd been drawing. Glowing with a bioluminescence that hurt to look at directly. I should have been terrified. Should have pulled anchor and run. But I felt calm. Expected. Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That's when I heard the voice. Not with my ears, inside my head. Speaking in harmonics that human throats could never produce. You returned. What are you? We are the deep, the forgotten, the ones who wait. Wait for what? For the land to remember it was once sea, for the small ones to remember they were once ours. The fish, the dead fish. Messengers, warnings, gifts. You did not listen. People need to know. The world needs to. The world knows. Deep in the blood, deep in the bone. Why do you think they fear dark water? Why do they make rules about places they claim not to understand? The knowledge sleeps, but it remembers. The structures kept rising, breaking the surface now. Water cascading off angles that shouldn't exist, and on every surface, eyes, thousands of them. All looking at me, all waiting. You carry our mark now, drew our words, dream our dreams. You are between. Between what? Between what was and what will be, between the dry and the deep. You will know when. When what? But the structures were already sinking, descending back into darkness. The eyes closing one by one, the patterns fading. And I was alone on a small boat in the middle of Lake Michigan, wondering if I'd imagined it all. Except my phone had recorded everything. 3 hours of footage I don't remember taking, but when I tried to watch it, static. Just static and audio that sounded like whale songs played backward. Except sometimes in that static, I swear I can see patterns. The same ones I keep drawing. The same ones that appear on my walls when I'm not looking. The same ones I see every time I close my eyes. They're getting clearer. Ending hook. I'm telling you this story because last night, the patterns finally made sense. They're not coordinates, they're instructions. A countdown. And according to what I can translate, it ends tonight. If you're listening to this, if you're one of the thousands who boat on Lake Michigan every summer, remember the rules. Stay in the shipping lanes. Don't anchor where no one else anchors. And if you see dead fish floating in a perfect circle, run. Because the deep ones aren't sleeping anymore. They're waiting. And some of us, the ones who've seen them, who carry their mark, we're waiting too, even though we don't want to, even though we try to resist. Every night, I feel myself getting pulled back to those coordinates. 42 degrees, 36.71 degrees north, 86 degrees, 52.87 degrees west. Tonight, I think I'm finally going to answer that call. If someone finds this recording, if my boat turns up empty like all the others, just remember, the lake has rules. Follow them, because what's down there in the deep, it's been waiting so much longer than we've been here. And one day soon, it's going to stop waiting. Sweet dreams. Oh, and if you found yourself drawing strange patterns while listening to this, circles within circles, angles that don't quite fit, you might want to stay away from large bodies of water for a while. The deep ones have such wonderful dreams, and they're always looking for new minds to share them with. 3 long beats of silence. Still there, still listening, good, because I need to tell you one last thing. The thing I didn't want to admit. The reason I really went back that second time. It wasn't curiosity. They called me, and if you've made it this far into my story, if you felt that pull to keep listening even though every instinct told you to stop, they're calling you too. Pleasant dreams. And whatever you do, don't look up those coordinates. Don't let them into your head, because once they're in, they never, ever leave. Story number 2. The chips stopped clicking at exactly 11:59 p.m. every single night. And that's when I first noticed they weren't breathing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you something that'll make you question every late-night casino you've ever walked into. Something that made me quit the best-paying job I ever had. And something that still makes me check my rearview mirror whenever I drive past the neon lights of Vegas. If you've ever felt that strange chill in a casino at midnight, if you've ever noticed how some players never seem to blink, then you already know more than you think you do. And by the end of this story, you'll wish you didn't. Now, let me tell you what really happens when the clock strikes midnight in Vegas. The story begins now. My name's Marcus Delacroix. And for 3 years, I was a blackjack dealer at the Golden Horseshoe Casino on Fremont Street. Not the Strip, mind you. Fremont Street, where the old Vegas still breathes. Or at least, where it used to. I'd moved to Vegas from Tulsa, Oklahoma, chasing what every 25-year-old chases, easy money and easier living. The dealer's school promised good tips, flexible hours, and all the excitement of Vegas nightlife. What they didn't mention was the 11:59 p.m. shift. My first week was normal enough. I worked the swing shift, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., dealing to tourists from Iowa, businessmen from New York, and locals who knew exactly when to hit and when to stand. The Golden Horseshoe wasn't fancy like the Bellagio or the Wynn. It had that old Vegas charm, cigarette-stained carpets that hadn't been changed since the 70s, and slot machines that still took actual coins. The casino had its own peculiar rhythm. During the day, it attracted retirees feeding quarters into slots and casual tourists learning the ropes. Evening brought the serious gamblers, the ones who studied cards like scripture and calculated odds in their heads. But there was something different about the late-night crowd. Something I couldn't quite name at first. Tommy Nguyen trained me, a Vietnamese guy who'd been dealing for 15 years. "Listen, Marcus," he said on my third night, shuffling cards with the kind of fluid grace that only comes from handling thousands of decks. Every casino has its quirks. Ours is the midnight crowd. I laughed. What, they tip bad? Tommy's smile faded. No, they don't tip at all. That should have been my first warning. But I was young, cocky, fresh out of dealer's school with dreams of making enough money to buy a house in Summerlin. I figured Tommy was just trying to scare the new guy. Some kind of hazing ritual that all casino veterans put rookies through. The thing about dealing cards is that it becomes automatic. Muscle memory. Shuffle, cut, deal, collect, pay out, repeat. Your hands move while your mind wanders, but you always watch the players. You have to. It's part of the job. Watch for card counters, watch for cheats, watch for drunks who might cause trouble. By my second week, I started noticing patterns. Every night, around 11:45 p.m., certain players would appear. They didn't come through the main entrance. At least, I never saw them enter. They'd just be there, sitting at my table or the ones nearby. What struck me first wasn't their appearance. It was their behavior. Regular players had tells, nervous habits, patterns of movement. They'd fidget with their chips, tap their fingers, shift in their seats. These midnight players were perfectly still, like photographs that had learned to walk. They dressed normal enough, business casual mostly, like they'd just gotten off work from some office job. But something was off. Their clothes were always slightly out of style, not vintage, not retro, just wrong. Like someone trying to remember what people wore but getting the details mixed up. The fabric looked right from a distance, but up close it had an odd texture, too smooth, too uniform. Their shoes never showed wear, never had scuff marks or dust. Even their hair seemed frozen in place, not styled, just positioned. "Deal me in," one of them said that Tuesday night. His voice was flat, no accent, no emotion, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. I nodded and shuffled. The automatic motions kicked in, but I kept glancing at him. Middle-aged white guy, brown hair, brown eyes. Completely forgettable except for one thing. He never blinked. Not once in the entire hand. Regular players blink every few seconds. It's human nature. Even the most focused card counters can't suppress that basic reflex. But this man stared at his cards with unwavering intensity, his eyes never moving, never watering, never showing any sign of natural function. He played perfectly. Textbook perfect. Hit on 16 against a dealer's 7. Stood on 12 against a dealer's 6. It wasn't card counting. It was like he knew the mathematics of the game at a cellular level. I'd seen good players before. Professionals who could calculate odds faster than most people could add simple numbers. But this was different. This wasn't calculation. It was knowledge. Absolute, certain knowledge of what each card would be before it was revealed. And then I noticed his chest. It wasn't moving. At first I thought I was seeing things. The casino lighting plays tricks. All those neon reflections and cigarette smoke. But no, his chest was completely still. No rise, no fall, nothing. I dealt the next hand, trying not to stare. But now I couldn't unsee it. The woman next to him, same thing. The man at the far end of the table, not breathing either. My hands started shaking, just slightly, but enough that I fumbled the cards. "Everything all right, dealer?" the man asked, that same flat tone. Yes, sir, just a long shift." He smiled, but only his mouth moved. His eyes stayed exactly the same, like a doll's eyes, glassy and fixed. The clock on the wall showed 11:58 p.m. 1 minute until midnight. The chips on the table started vibrating, just barely, like when a truck drives by and makes the windows rattle. But there was no truck, no earthquake, nothing that should cause it. 11:59 p.m. Every single chip in the casino stopped moving. The slot machines went quiet. Even the background music seemed to pause. And in that silence I heard it. Or rather, I didn't hear it. No breathing. Not from any of the midnight players. Not a single exhale. Not a single inhale. Just silence where there should have been the subtle sound of life. The man in front of me placed his bet, $25. The same bet he'd been making all night. I dealt the cards with trembling fingers. He got a 19. I had showing a 6. I flipped my whole card, a 10, making 16. The rules said I had to hit. I drew a 5, 21. House wins, I announced, my voice cracking slightly. The man smiled that empty smile again. The house always wins at midnight. Then the clock ticked over to 12 a.m., and the casino erupted back to life. Slot machines dinged, people laughed, chips clicked against each other. And when I looked back at my table, the midnight players were gone. Just gone. The normal players didn't seem to notice. They kept playing like nothing had happened. Like there hadn't been 3 people sitting there 10 seconds ago. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? "Hey boss, some of our customers don't breathe." Yeah, that would go over well. But I started paying attention, taking notes in a little notebook I kept in my dealer's vest. Every night they appeared at 11:45 p.m. Always different faces, but the same feeling. That's the only way I can describe it. Like looking at a photograph of a person instead of the person themselves. 3-dimensional, moving, talking, but fundamentally wrong. The strangest part was how they affected the atmosphere around them. Temperature would drop by a few degrees at their tables, not enough for most people to notice, but I felt it every night. The air became thinner somehow, harder to breathe, as if they were absorbing something vital from the environment. Tommy noticed me getting jumpy during the late shifts. "You see them now?" he said one night during our break. It wasn't a question. The ones who don't, I couldn't even say it out loud. Breathe, yeah. He lit a cigarette. The irony wasn't lost on me. Been seeing them for years. You get used to it. How can you get used to that? What are they? Tommy took a long drag. You ever wonder why Vegas never sleeps? Why the casinos never close? It's not for the tourists, Marcus. It's for them. They need somewhere to go at midnight. Somewhere with lights and noise and life. Even if they don't have any themselves. That doesn't make sense. Nothing about this city makes sense. He stubbed out his cigarette. Just deal their cards, take their money, and don't ask questions. That's what I do. That's what we all do. But I couldn't let it go. I started arriving early, staying late, watching. The midnight players always played until exactly 12:13 a.m. Then they'd cash out and leave. Except they never actually walked to the cashier. They'd just stand up, and their chips would already be gone, converted to nothing. I tried counting their chips once, keeping track of their wins and losses, but the numbers never added up. They'd bet hundreds of dollars over the course of their session, but when I calculated their net position, it always came to zero, exactly zero. Not close to zero, not within a few dollars, but perfectly, impossibly balanced. One night in October, a particularly slow Tuesday, I decided to follow one of them. A woman this time, elderly, wearing a floral dress that looked straight out of 1962. She'd been playing at my table, betting exactly $5 every hand, never winning, never losing big, just existing in that strange space between profit and loss. At 12:13 a.m., she stood up. I quickly signaled to Tommy to cover my table, told him I needed a bathroom break, and followed her. She walked through the casino floor, but nobody looked at her. Not the security guards, not the other players, not even the cocktail waitresses who were trained to notice everyone. It was like she existed in a different layer of reality, visible but unnoticed. She headed toward the old part of the casino, the section they'd been meaning to renovate for years but never got around to. The lights were dimmer there. Some of the slot machines were covered with sheets, like furniture in an abandoned house. She stopped at a door marked "Employees Only," but it wasn't a door I recognized. I'd been working there for months, knew every break room, every supply closet, but this door was new, or old, I couldn't tell. She opened it without a key, and I saw stairs leading down, way down. Deeper than the basement should go. The walls were different too. Not the gaudy wallpaper of the casino, but bare concrete, sweating with moisture despite the desert air. She started down the stairs, and I followed, keeping my distance, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she'd hear it. But she never turned around, just kept descending. One step, then another, then another. The temperature dropped with each step, from Vegas heat to air-conditioned cool to something else, something that made my breath visible, except I realized I was the only one breathing. My exhales came out in small puffs of vapor, but she produced nothing. No breath, no body heat, nothing that marked her as alive. The stairs ended at another door, this one metal, industrial, like something from an old factory. She pushed it open, and the sound that came from beyond made me stop cold. Slot machines, hundreds of them, all playing at once, but wrong. The music was backwards, the dings were in minor keys, and underneath it all, a sound like wind through a cave, or the last breath of a dying man played on a loop. Through the gap in the door, I saw them, dozens of the midnight players, all sitting at machines, pulling levers, pressing buttons. But the screens showed no games, just faces. Human faces, terrified, screaming, trapped behind the glass. The woman turned then, not her body, just her head. A full 180 degrees, anatomically impossible, and looked right at me. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said, but her mouth didn't move. The voice came from somewhere else, everywhere else, inside my head. I ran up those stairs faster than I've ever run in my life, burst through the door, and found myself back on the casino floor. But it was different. The clock showed 11:59 p.m., even though I knew I'd been gone for at least 20 minutes. Tommy was at my table, dealing to the regular crowd. He looked up as I approached, sweat pouring down my face, chest heaving. "Bathroom break?" he asked, but his eyes said he knew. I nodded, unable to speak. "First rule of the midnight shift," he said quietly, "never follow them. Second rule, never go through doors that shouldn't exist." "What's the third rule?" I managed to ask. He dealt another hand before answering. "There is no third rule, because nobody's ever needed one. They either learn the first two or they don't come back." I should have quit. Any sane person would have quit. But the money was too good, and more than that, I needed to know. What were they? Why were they here? What was behind that door? I started researching. Spending my days at the library, looking up old newspapers, casino records, anything about the Golden Horseshoe. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1973, there had been a fire in the casino. An electrical problem in one of the basement storage rooms. It happened at 11:59 p.m. on a busy Saturday night. The fire suppression system failed. The emergency exits were locked from the outside. A perfect storm of negligence and bad timing. 17 people died, trapped in a basement meeting room where they'd been counting the night's take. The newspaper said they died of smoke inhalation. But one survivor, a janitor named Eugene Morrison, told a different story. I found Eugene in a nursing home in Henderson. 93 years old, sharp as a tack, and terrified when I mentioned the golden horseshoe. They didn't die from the smoke, he told me, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. The smoke was bad, sure, but that's not what killed them. It was the panic, the realization that they were trapped. They stopped breathing before the smoke ever reached them. Fear took their breath away, literally. That doesn't make medical sense. Nothing about that night made sense. He leaned closer. I saw them during the cleanup. Their lungs were clear, no soot, no smoke damage, nothing. Like they'd just forgotten how to breathe. And then, a week later, I saw one of them back at the casino, playing blackjack at table 7, same face, same clothes, but wrong, all wrong. Did you tell anyone? Eugene laughed, bitter and harsh. Who'd believe me? But I'll tell you something else. Something I've never told anyone. They offered me a job that night, the dead ones. Said I could join them, work the midnight shift forever, never age, never die, just exist in that space between 11:59 and 12:13. What did you say? I ran, quit that very night, never set foot in a casino again. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. They'll offer you too, if you stay long enough. If you see too much, they always need more dealers for the midnight shift. I left Henderson with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, I was in too deep. That night, I went back to work, determined to act normal, to not let on that I knew, but they knew that I knew. At 11:45 p.m. they appeared as usual, but this time, they all sat at my table. 7 of them, the maximum, all staring at me with those unblinking eyes. Deal, the one in the center said, a young man who looked about my age, wearing a dealer's vest just like mine, but from a different era. The golden horseshoe logo was different, older. I dealt. They played in perfect synchronization, betting the same amounts, making the same decisions, like they were one mind in 7 bodies. And then, at 11:59 p.m., when the chips stopped clicking, they all spoke in unison. We have an offer for you, Marcus. My hands froze mid-shuffle. You've seen beyond the veil. You know what we are, what this place really is. You can't go back to not knowing. I don't want to be like you, I said, surprised by my own courage. No? They tilted their heads, all at the same angle, like puppets on the same string. You deal cards to people who lose their life savings. You watch them destroy themselves hand by hand. How different are you from us, really? I'm alive, I breathe. Breathing is overrated, they said. And for just a moment, they inhaled, all together. And the sound was like a vacuum cleaner in reverse, unnatural and wrong. We found something better. Existence without the fear of death. Purpose without the pain of life. What purpose? Playing rigged games in a basement. They smiled, those empty synchronized smiles. Every casino needs its house edge. We are that edge. We play the games that keep the balance. Win the money that needs to be won. Lose the money that needs to be lost. We keep the machine running. And if I say no, then you leave, tonight, and never come back. But you'll always wonder, always dream about that door, about what's really down those stairs. And one day, when you're old, when breathing becomes hard, you'll wish you'd said yes. The clock ticked to midnight. The casino roared back to life, and they were gone. Tommy appeared at my shoulder. They made the offer? I nodded. What did you say? Nothing, yet. He sighed. That's the worst answer. Saying nothing means the offer stays open. They'll wait. They've got nothing but time. I lasted another month. Every night they came. Every night they played at my table. And every night at 11:59 p.m., they'd look at me with those empty eyes. waiting for an answer. The worst part was, I started to understand them. The regular players, the living ones. They were just as hollow in their own way, chasing losses, believing in systems that didn't exist, breathing, sure, but were they really alive? Mrs. Chen came in every Tuesday, lost her Social Security check at the penny slots, went home to an empty apartment where she'd eat cat food until her next check arrived. Mr. Rodriguez brought his paycheck every Friday, convinced that this time would be different, that he'd hit the jackpot and pay off his mortgage. Instead, he'd lose everything and have to explain to his wife why they couldn't make rent again. Were their lives really so much more meaningful than the existence offered by the midnight players? At least the dead ones weren't destroying themselves, weren't hurting anyone else with their choices. November turned to December. The casino decorated for Christmas, tinsel and fake snow in the middle of the desert. And still they waited. Then, on December 20th, everything changed. A man sat at my table at 11:30 p.m., 15 minutes before the midnight crowd usually arrived. He was breathing. I could see his chest rise and fall, but something about him felt familiar. "Marcus," he said, and I recognized the voice. It was Eugene Morrison, but not the 93-year-old I'd met in Henderson. This was Eugene from 1973, young, healthy, and terrified. "Eugene? How?" "I lied," he said, dealing himself into the game. "I didn't run that night. I said yes. I took their offer, and for 50 years I've been playing the same games, dealing the same cards, existing in that space between midnight and nowhere. But I met you. You were old. You met what I left behind, a shell, a recording. The real me has been here all along, and now it's time for you to choose. Really choose, because tomorrow night is the anniversary. 50 years since the fire, and they need a new dealer for the basement tables. Why are you telling me this? Because someone should know the truth before they decide." He leaned forward, and for just a moment, I saw him flicker, like a TV with bad reception, young to old to young again. The offer isn't just about existing forever. It's about becoming part of the machine, the thing that keeps Vegas running. We're not dead, Marcus, we're something else, something necessary. Necessary for what? Every city has its engine. New York has ambition. Los Angeles has dreams. Vegas has us, the ones who keep the odds in the house's favor, not through cheating, but through existence itself. We are probability made flesh, or what used to be flesh. The clock showed 11:44 p.m. 1 minute until they arrived. "If you say yes," Eugene continued, "you'll deal cards forever. You'll see every possible hand, every combination, every win and loss that has ever been or ever will be. You'll understand the mathematics of chance in a way that living humans never could, but you'll never feel the thrill of winning or the pain of losing again. You'll never breathe because you'll never need to. You'll never die because you're already beyond death. And if I say no, then you walk out that door and never come back. But the knowledge will eat at you. You'll see patterns everywhere, probabilities in every moment. You'll know that every choice is just another hand being dealt, and you'll always wonder if you made the right bet." 11:45 p.m. They appeared, all 7 of them, plus 3 more I'd never seen before. 10 midnight players, all staring at me, waiting. "It's time, Marcus," they said in unison. "The final hand. Yes or no. In or out. Breathe or don't." I looked at my cards, a king and an ace, blackjack, the perfect hand. But was it really perfect if it was predetermined? Was winning worth anything if you couldn't lose? "Deal 1 more hand," I said. "If I win, I walk away. If you win, I join you." They smiled. Those empty, knowing smiles. The house always wins at midnight, Marcus. You know this. I dealt the cards anyway, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. They got 20, I got 21. But then something impossible happened. The ace in my hand flickered, changed, became a 5. Making my hand 16, I had to hit. I drew. A 10, bust. "The house always wins," they repeated, standing as one. "Welcome to the midnight shift." And in that moment, I had to make a choice. Accept the impossible, accept that the game was rigged from the start. Or I grabbed the deck, all of it, and threw it in the air. 52 cards scattered like snow, and in the confusion, I ran. Out the door, past the security guards who didn't even look up, into the Las Vegas night where the air was cold and harsh and absolutely necessary. I drove straight through until I hit the California border, and I didn't stop until I reached the ocean, where I stood on the beach and breathed. Really breathed. For what felt like the first time in months. That was 3 years ago. I work at a small bookstore in Portland now. No cards, no gambling, no midnight shifts, but sometimes, when it's late and quiet, I swear I can hear them. The clicking of chips, the shuffle of cards, the sound of games being played by people who don't breathe. And sometimes, just sometimes, at 11:59 p.m., I catch myself holding my breath, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd said yes, if I'd joined them in that space between midnight and nowhere. The offer is still open, I know that. It will always be open, because they have nothing but time. And one day, when breathing becomes too hard, when life becomes too heavy, I might just take it. But not tonight. Tonight I breathe. Tonight I'm alive. Tonight I stay on this side of midnight. Even though I know, deep down, that the house always wins in the end. You know, they say every casino has cameras everywhere, watching every table, every player, every dealer. So, if you're ever in Vegas, at the Golden Horseshoe, around 11:59 p.m., look for the players who don't breathe. Watch their chest. Count the seconds between their blinks. And if you see them, if you really see them, well, don't follow them. Don't go through doors that shouldn't exist. And whatever you do, don't take their offer, unless you're tired of breathing too. Tell me, have you ever noticed how some people at casinos never seem to need a break? Never get up to use the bathroom? Never order a drink? Have you ever wondered why? Maybe you should visit the Golden Horseshoe sometime. Table 7, 11:59 p.m. Just remember to keep breathing while you still can. Story number 3. Listen, I need to tell you something. Something that's been eating at me for the past 3 months. You think you know about Derry, Maine because of those books, those movies. But Stephen King, he got it wrong. Or maybe he got it too right and had to change things. Make it fiction. Make it safe. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm a paranormal investigator. Well, was, after what happened in Derry last October. I don't know if I can do this anymore. But you deserve to know the truth. The real truth about what's happening in that town right now, as we speak. Before you ask, yes, I have proof. Videos, photos, audio recordings that will make your skin crawl. But first, let me ask you something. Have you noticed how many people from Maine have gone missing in the past year? No, of course not. Because nobody's connecting the dots. Nobody except me and the 12 other people who were there that night. Well, the 9 who are still alive, anyway. If you're listening to this late at night, maybe turn on another light. Trust me on this one. The story begins now. October 7th, 3:17 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand of my Portland hotel room. Unknown number, Maine area code, I almost didn't answer. Almost. Marcus Chen? The voice was shaky, female, young, maybe early 20s. Yeah, who's this? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling from Derry. You investigate paranormal stuff, right? Real stuff, not the fake YouTube garbage. I sat up, something in her voice. Yeah, what's going on? She paused. I could hear her breathing, rapid, scared. Something's wrong with our town. People are changing. And there's this sound at night. What kind of sound? Another pause, longer this time. Like breathing. But underground. Like the whole town is sitting on top of something that's sleeping. And I think it's starting to wake up. Now, I've gotten hundreds of calls like this over the years. Most are pranks. Some are mental health issues. But occasionally they're real. And something about Sarah's voice. Can you meet me tomorrow? She asked. Please? I'll pay your travel expenses, consultation fee, whatever you need. Sarah, I need you to be straight with me. Is this about the Stephen King stuff? Because I don't do tourist. No. She almost shouted it. Then quieter. No. This started 2 months ago, August 15th to be exact. That's when they found the first tunnel. Tunnel? Under the library. They were doing renovations, replacing old pipes. The construction crew broke through into this space. It shouldn't exist, Mr. Chen. The blueprints, the geological surveys, nothing shows it should be there, but it is. And it goes down, way down. I grabbed my notebook, started writing. Did anyone go into it? Silence, then 3 workers went down. Only 2 came back, and they won't talk about what they saw. They just sit there, staring. My brother was one of them. That's what got me. The way her voice broke when she said brother. I'll be there by noon, I told her. The drive from Portland to Derry takes about 2.5 hours on a good day. That Tuesday morning, it took me 4. Not because of traffic, but because the closer I got to Derry, the more my GPS kept glitching, recalculating, sending me in circles, like something didn't want me to find the town. But I made it. Pulled into the parking lot of Derry Public Library at 12:43 p.m. Sarah was waiting by the entrance. Thin, blonde, dark circles under her eyes like, she hadn't slept in days. She probably hadn't. Thank you for coming, she said, shaking my hand. Her palm was cold, clammy. Show me the tunnel, I said. She led me around to the back of the library where yellow construction tape blocked off an area. No workers, no security, just tape. They all quit, Sarah explained. After what happened to Tommy, my brother, nobody wants to work here. We ducked under the tape. The entrance to the tunnel was in the basement, a jagged hole in the concrete floor about 6 feet wide. The edges looked melted, like something hot had burned through. I shined my flashlight down. The walls were smooth, too smooth, almost glass-like, and they curved down at an angle that made my eyes water trying to follow it. How deep? I asked. Nobody knows. They sent a drone down, lost signal after 300 feet. But the weird thing. She pulled out her phone, showed me a video. This is the last thing it recorded. The footage was grainy, dark, but I could make out shapes, geometric patterns carved into the tunnel walls, symbols that hurt to look at, and at the very edge of the frame, something moving, something large. What is that? I whispered. We don't know, but Mr. Chen, that's not the worst part. She swiped to another video. This one was clearer. Security footage from the library's main floor, dated 3 days ago. Timestamp, 2:47 a.m. At first, nothing. Just the empty library, rows of books, dim emergency lighting, Then, movement. The floor rippled. Like water. Like something massive had shifted underneath. Books fell from shelves. And then I heard it. Even through the phone's tiny speaker, that sound, breathing, deep, rhythmic, patient, like something enormous drawing air into lungs the size of buildings. It happens every night now, Sarah said. Between 2 and 4 a.m. The whole town feels it. Some people have started leaving, but others, she trailed off. Others what? Others are drawn to it. They stand outside the library at night, just listening, swaying back and forth. My brother is one of them. After seeing the tunnel, I knew this was bigger than a simple haunting. I spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon talking to people around town. What I found, it changed everything. The first person I interviewed was Margaret Kessler, an 83-year-old retired teacher who'd lived in Derry her entire life. She invited me into her small house on Witcham Street, served me tea with shaking hands, and told me things that made my blood run cold. "It's happened before," she whispered, glancing toward her basement door like something might be listening. "When I was 7 years old, 1947, there were tunnels then too, different ones. They opened after the big storm that spring." She showed me a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Derry News, dated May 3, 1947. "Mysterious sinkhole claims 3 children." The article described how 3 kids had fallen into a hole that opened suddenly in Bassey Park. Their bodies were never found. "But that's not all," Margaret continued. "My grandmother used to tell stories about 1920 and 1893 and 1866, always 27 years apart, always the same pattern. Tunnels, disappearances, and then silence. Until now," I said. She nodded. "But this time is different. The breathing, it's stronger, angrier. Like whatever's down there is tired of waiting." From Margaret's house, I drove to the Derry Historical Society. The building was old, Victorian, with a basement archive that smelled of mildew and decay. The librarian, a nervous man named David Park, showed me records dating back to the town's founding. What I found in those dusty files defied explanation. Derry was built on land that no Native American tribe would claim. The original surveyor's notes from 1831 described strange acoustic phenomena, sounds from underground that drove their horses mad. Several surveyors quit the job. 2 disappeared entirely. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of photographs from 1920, black and white images showing excavation work near what is now the town center. In one photo, you could see workers standing around a hole in the ground, but if you looked closely, really closely, there were shadows in that hole, shadows that didn't match anything on the surface. And the workers' faces, God, their faces. Even in the grainy photo, you could see the terror in their eyes. "We're not supposed to show these to the public," David whispered, as he handled the photos with white cotton gloves. The town council classified them as historically sensitive back in 1967. "Why? Look at the last photo." He showed me an image taken from farther away. The excavation site was visible, but so was the area around it. And standing in a perfect circle around the hole, people, dozens of them, all facing inward, all perfectly still, the listeners. Even in 1920, they existed. That evening, I returned to Sarah at the motel. She was sitting on her bed, staring at her phone. "Any word from Tommy?" I asked. She shook her head. "He's been standing outside the library since noon, just standing there. I drove by an hour ago. There are more now, maybe 20 people. And, Mr. Chen, the hole is bigger." "Bigger how?" "It's not just in the basement anymore. It's spreading, eating through the foundation. The whole library is going to collapse soon. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of what I'd learned, but because of what I could feel. A presence, heavy, ancient, pressing down on the town like a weighted blanket, and underneath it all, that breathing. Even from the motel, even through walls and distance, I could hear it. At 2 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep and walked to the window. The parking lot was empty except for my rental car, but beyond it, in the direction of the library, I saw lights, flashlights or lanterns, moving in procession through the streets. I grabbed my camera and slipped outside. The October air was bitter cold, but not from temperature. This was a different kind of cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and won't leave. I followed the lights through the residential streets of Derry, past houses where normal people slept in their beds, unaware that their neighbors were walking through the night like sleepwalkers. The procession moved silently. No talking, no footsteps. Just the soft shuffle of feet on pavement. They led me to the library. What I saw there, it's burned into my memory forever. The building was listing to one side like a sinking ship. Cracks ran up the walls like black lightning. And in the basement, the hole had grown. I could see it through the broken foundation. 8 feet across now, maybe 9, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound coming from below. Not breathing this time. Voices. Hundreds of them singing in harmony. A lullaby that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. And I recognized some of the voices. People who'd disappeared over the years. Children from decades past. All singing the same wordless song. The listeners stood in their circle, swaying to the rhythm. Tommy was among them, his face blank as paper. But as I watched, more people emerged from the shadows. The town doctor, the bank president, even a state police officer whose cruiser was parked nearby. One by one, they joined the circle. One by one, they began to sway. I backed away, heart pounding, and nearly collided with someone behind me. Beautiful, isn't it? I spun around. A woman stood there. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with kind eyes. She looked completely normal, completely sane. The singing, she continued. It reminds me of my daughter. She used to sing me to sleep when she was little. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Before she went down there. Before she joined them. "Ma'am, you need to get away from here," I said. "This isn't safe." She smiled. "Safe? Oh, honey, this is the safest place in the world. Down there, nothing can hurt you. Nothing can disappoint you. There's just the song, forever and always." She took a step toward the library, then another. "Ma'am!" But she was already walking toward the circle, already beginning to sway. In moments, she was indistinguishable from the others. I ran back to the motel, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock my door. Sarah was waiting inside, her face pale as moonlight. "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "It's getting stronger." Every night, more people join. And the hole, it keeps growing. Soon it'll be big enough for whatever's down there to come up. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. "We're going down," I said. "What?" "Tomorrow night, we're going into the tunnel. We need to see what's down there, document it, find a way to stop it." Sarah stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. "Mr. Chen, people who go down there don't come back, or if they do, they're different. Then we make sure we come back the same. We go prepared, ropes, lights, emergency beacons, and we don't go alone. Who else would be crazy enough to... The other families, the ones with missing loved ones, the ones who haven't joined the listeners yet, they're our best hope." It took all of the next day to convince them. Margaret Kessler, whose grandson had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. David Park from the Historical Society, whose wife was now among the listeners. Dr. James Morrison, who'd lost both his daughters to the hole. By evening, we had a group of 7. 7 people willing to descend into hell itself if it meant getting their families back. We had no idea what we were walking into. We had no idea that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. That night, I set up my equipment in the library. EMF detectors, infrared cameras, motion sensors, the works. Sarah stayed with me. Said she didn't want to be alone. I understood. The building felt wrong after dark. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. 10 p.m. Nothing. 11 p.m. Minor EMF spikes, but that could be the old wiring. Midnight. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 30 seconds. 1 a.m. That's when I saw them through the window. People, dozens of them, walking toward the library, moving in perfect synchronization. Same pace, same rhythm, like puppets on identical strings. That's them, Sarah whispered, the listeners. They formed a circle around the building. Men, women, even a few teenagers, all with the same blank expression. Among them, I spotted a young man who looked like Sarah, Tommy. His eyes were open but empty, like nobody was home. "We need to document this," I said, grabbing my camera. But when I tried to film them, the camera shut off. Tried my phone. Same thing. Every piece of electronic equipment just died. Then came 2 a.m. The breathing started exactly at 2. Not from the tunnel, from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself seemed to inhale and exhale. The listeners outside began to sway, slow, hypnotic, in time with the breathing. I watched my analog watch. The second hand was moving backward. "This is impossible," I muttered. Sarah grabbed my arm. Her nails dug in. "Look at the books." The books on the shelves were changing, the text on the spines rearranging itself, forming new words. Same message over and over. It feeds, it grows, it rises. Then I heard something from the tunnel. Not breathing this time. Voice, multiple voices, singing. The melody was beautiful, horrifying, like every lullaby you've ever heard mixed with screaming. "We need to leave," I said, but Sarah was already walking toward the tunnel. That same blank expression on her face. "Sarah!" I grabbed her, shook her, her eyes focused. I heard Mom," she whispered. "She was calling me, but she's been dead for 5 years." That's when I realized. The singing. It was using familiar voices. Loved ones, drawing people down. We ran. Got to my car, drove to the motel on the edge of town. But even there, we could feel it. That presence, growing stronger. "We need help," I said. "Other investigators, maybe even the authorities." Sarah laughed, bitter. "You think we haven't tried?" The state police came once, took one look at the tunnel and left. Said it was a local matter, the FBI agent who showed up. He joined the listeners after one night. Then we document everything, post it online, make people pay attention. With what? Nothing electronic works near the library after midnight. She was right, but I had an idea. Old school documentation. Film cameras, tape recorders, analog equipment that might not be affected. The next day, I drove to Portland. Bought everything I could find. When I returned to Derry that evening, the town felt different, heavier, like the air was thick with something invisible. Sarah met me at the motel. She looked worse, hair unwashed, clothes wrinkled. "It's getting stronger," she said. Last night, the breathing lasted until 5 a.m., and more people joined the listeners, the mayor, the sheriff, half the town council. Then we work fast. October 9th, our second night of documentation, this time with analog equipment. The library was cold. Our breath came out in clouds. I set up the film camera on a tripod, pointed at the tunnel entrance. The tape recorder went on the desk, fresh cassette loaded. 11 p.m. The listeners arrived earlier this time. More of them. Maybe 60 people now. They didn't form a circle. They lined up, single file, facing the library entrance. "They want to come in," Sarah breathed. I checked the door. Locked, barricaded with desks. But the way they stood there, patient, waiting, it made my skin crawl. Midnight came fast. The temperature plummeted. Ice formed on the windows. And then the floor began to crack. Spiderweb fractures spreading from the tunnel entrance. The breathing started at 12:03, but louder this time, angry. The film camera kept rolling, the tape recorder spinning. Then Sarah grabbed my arm, pointed at the tunnel. Something was coming up. At first, just a glow, pale blue, phosphorescent. Then I saw it, a hand, but wrong. Too many fingers, too many joints, pulling itself up from the deep. Behind it, others, dozens, climbing, crawling. Things that might have been human once, but changed, evolved, adapted to whatever was down there. The first one fully emerged. 7 feet tall, thin. Its skin was translucent. I could see organs underneath, but the organs were in the wrong places. Heart in the throat, lungs in the stomach, and its eyes, God, its eyes were human. Terrified, aware, it opened its mouth. Sarah's mother's voice came out. "Sarah, honey, come home." Sarah took a step forward. I grabbed her, more emerged. Each one speaking in a different voice, calling names, some I recognized from the listeners outside. Tommy, David, Margaret, Jennifer, then one looked directly at me. When it spoke, it was my father's voice. My father who died when I was 12. "Marcus, I've been waiting for you. It's beautiful down here. No more pain, no more fear, just the eternal embrace of the deep." I felt my feet moving, couldn't stop them. The camera kept rolling. The tape kept recording, but I was walking toward the tunnel. Sarah screamed, tackled me. We hit the floor hard. The spell broke. "We have to destroy it," she gasped. "The tunnel. Close it somehow. But how do you destroy something that shouldn't exist?" The things from below kept emerging. Dozens now, moving towards the doors. The barricade wouldn't hold. That's when I remembered something. The construction crew. They'd broken through from above, which meant the basement, I said. The original floor. "It's still there, right? Just broken?" Sarah nodded. "Concrete. We need concrete. Lots of it. There's a hardware store 2 blocks away. Go. Now. Bring everything. I'll hold them off. Don't ask me how I held them off. I barely remember. Just fragments, throwing books, chairs, anything to keep them back." The film camera fell, kept recording from the floor. The tape recorder captured everything, the screaming, the sound of breaking wood as they destroyed the barricade. Sarah returned with help. Not the police, not the authorities. Other listeners who'd broken free. People who'd realized what was happening. Together, we poured bag after bag of quick-set concrete into the tunnel. The things below shrieked, tried to climb out, but the concrete was already hardening. One grabbed my ankle as I poured. Its touch burned like ice, left marks that still haven't healed. But I kept pouring. It took 6 hours, until dawn, but we sealed it. Every inch. The breathing stopped. The listeners collapsed where they stood. When they woke, they remembered nothing. That should have been the end. We sealed the tunnel, saved the town. Everyone could go back to normal, except 3 days later, another tunnel opened. This time under the high school, then another under the hospital, and another under the town hall. The pattern became clear. It wasn't random. Something underneath Derry was creating exits, trying to surface. And each time, more people joined the listeners. More people disappeared below. I stayed for 2 weeks, documenting everything. The film I shot, the recordings I made, they're the only proof that works. Digital copies corrupt, upload attempts fail, but the analog stuff, that survives. During those 2 weeks, I learned things. From old newspapers, from town records that went back centuries. Derry has always been wrong. People have been disappearing since it was founded in 1831. Every 27 years there's a spike. But this is different. Bigger. I found a journal in the library's archived section, written by a librarian in 1962. She described the same breathing, the same listeners. But back then, they managed to stop it. A group of 7 kids went into the tunnels with dynamite. Only 3 came back. But it worked for a while. The journal mentioned something else, a name. Not for the thing below Derry, but for what it serves, what it's preparing the way for. She called it the Dreamer in the Deep, said it had been sleeping under Maine since before humans walked the earth. And Derry was built right on top of its heart. The more tunnels that open, the closer it gets to waking. October 21st. My last night in Derry. I was packing my equipment when Sarah burst into my motel room. "It's happening," she gasped. "All the listeners, they're walking to the library, all of them. We drove there. Must have been 300 people standing in formation. The ground was shaking, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Then the library collapsed, just folded in on itself. And where it had been, a hole, massive, maybe 50 feet across. We could hear the singing from below. Hundreds of voices, thousands. Something was coming up, something huge. We ran, got in my car, drove. I looked back once, saw something emerge. Just for a second. A shape that my mind wouldn't process. Too big, too wrong, too real. Sarah and I made it to Portland. She's staying with friends, trying to forget. But I can't forget, because I know it's still happening. Right now, this moment. I've been monitoring the news. The government says there was a gas leak explosion in Derry. Evacuated the whole town, but that's not true. There is no town anymore, just a hole. And something that should never have woken up. But here's the thing, the really terrifying thing. Remember those other people who were with us that night? The 9 survivors I mentioned? 3 have gone missing in the last week. Just vanished. And the others, they've been having dreams. The same dream about tunnels opening in their towns. Portland, Bangor, Augusta, it's spreading. Last night, I had the dream too. Saw a tunnel opening under my apartment building in Boston. Heard that breathing, that singing, and the worst part of me wanted to go down, to join them, to see what's really down there in the deep. I'm uploading this story because people need to know, need to watch for the signs, the breathing at night, the listeners gathering, the tunnels that shouldn't exist. But also, I'm uploading this because I need help. If you're hearing this, if you've experienced something similar, contact me. We need to find others who know the truth, who've seen what's under the surface, because I don't think we stopped it. I think we just delayed it. And every night, the singing gets a little louder. Even here, even 300 miles from Derry. Sometimes I wonder, what if Stephen King knew? What if his stories were warnings disguised as fiction? What if he saw what was coming and tried to prepare us the only way he could? Because if that's true, then we're in more trouble than anyone realizes. The dreamer in the deep is waking up, and when it does, God help us all. Wait, do you hear that? That sound, like breathing? But that's impossible. I'm on the 10th floor. There's nothing underneath me but other apartments and... Oh no, oh God, no. There's someone at my door, knocking, slow, rhythmic. And they're humming that melody from the tunnels. I recognize the voice. It's Sarah. But Sarah's been dead for 3 days. I attended her funeral yesterday. She jumped from a bridge in Portland. Left a note saying the singing wouldn't stop. The knocking's getting louder. She's calling my name. If you're listening to this, don't trust anyone who's been to Derry. Don't trust anyone who talks about the tunnels. And whatever you do, whatever you hear, don't answer the door when they come knocking. Because once you let them in, you become one of them. The door is opening. I didn't unlock it. It's opening anyway. I can see her, Sarah, but her eyes are full of stars. Deep, dark stars from somewhere far below. She's smiling. She says it's beautiful down there. Says I should come see. Says everyone's waiting. Everyone who ever disappeared in Derry. They're all down there, waiting, singing, preparing for what's coming next. I think I'm going to go with her. The singing is so beautiful, so perfect. Why was I ever afraid? If you're still listening, I have one last thing to tell you. The most important thing. The tunnels. They're not just in Derry anymore. Check your basement. Check it tonight. Before it's too late, before you start hearing the breathing, before recording ends. Did you hear it too, that breathing sound in the background of this recording? Some say if you listen carefully, really carefully, you can still hear it. Even now, even in your own room. But that's impossible, right? Tell me in the comments if you heard something. Tell me I'm not going crazy. Tell me you don't hear breathing coming from beneath your floor right now. And whatever you do, don't look in your basement tonight. Sweet dreams. Story number 4. The GPS died somewhere between Pendleton and LeGrand. Just like that. 1 second showing the route along Interstate 84. Next second, nothing but a black screen. I pulled over at the next scenic overlook, my 2018 Honda CR-V, crunching gravel as I eased into the empty parking area. The October wind hit different up here in the Blue Mountains. Sharper, carrying something that made my skin prickle. That's when I saw it. An old wooden marker, weathered and splitting, with words carved deep into the grain. Oregon Trail, Barlow Road Alternative, 2 miles. The arrow pointed to a dirt path I hadn't noticed before, barely wide enough for a vehicle, disappearing into a thick wall of Douglas firs. Now, here's the thing, and I need you to understand this before I tell you what happened next. I'm a historian. Specifically, I study the Oregon Trail for the National Park Service. I've walked every documented mile of that historic route. I know every marker, every monument, every forgotten wagon rut from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City. And this marker shouldn't exist. The Barlow Road runs nowhere near this part of the Blue Mountains. It's 100 miles south, skirting Mount Hood. But the wood looked authentic, aged in that specific way that can't be faked. The carving style matched 1840s trail markers perfectly. My professional curiosity overrode common sense. I should have driven away. God, I should have just restarted my phone and continued to Portland for the conference. But if you found evidence that challenged everything you knew about your life's work, wouldn't you investigate? Wouldn't you need to know? The story begins now. I grabbed my field kit from the trunk. Camera, measuring tape, sample bags, the usual tools of my trade. The afternoon sun hung low, maybe 3 hours until dark. Plenty of time to document this anomaly and get back to the interstate. The dirt road felt wrong from the first step. Not physically wrong. It was well maintained, recently graded even. But the silence pressed against my ears like cotton. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place, leaving the tall pines motionless as cemetery stones. 20 yards in, I found the second marker. Same weathered wood, same carving style. Thompson family, made camp, October 1847. My breath caught. The Thompson family was real. I'd read their journals at the Oregon Historical Society. but they'd traveled the main trail, not some unknown northern route. Their daughter, Mary Thompson, had written extensively about their journey. She'd never mentioned this place. I photographed everything, my camera clicking too loud in the stillness. The path curved ahead, and through the trees I glimpsed something that made me stop cold. Wagon ruts. Deep, preserved wagon ruts. The kind you only find in the driest parts of Wyoming where rain never touches them. But here in Oregon's wet mountains, impossible. The soil should have reclaimed them decades ago. My phone buzzed. Just once. The screen showed a text from an unknown number. Turn back. Wrong year. I stared at the message. No signal bars. No service. How could I receive a text? I tried calling out, but the phone was dead again. Complete black screen, like before. The smart thing would be leaving. Every instinct screamed to return to my car. But 50 feet ahead, something white caught my eye. Canvas. Old canvas stretched over wooden hoops. A covered wagon sitting in a small clearing like it had just stopped for the night. I approached slowly, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the packed earth. The wagon looked perfect. Not restored perfect, but functionally perfect. Like someone had parked it yesterday despite the 1840s construction. The canvas showed wear but no rot. The iron wheel rims held no rust. Fresh scratches marked the wooden sides. Fresh as in hours old, not decades. "Hello?" My voice cracked. "Anyone here?" "I'm with the Park Service." Nothing. But as I circled the wagon, I noticed the ground around it. Footprints. Dozens of them. Boot prints with square nails in the soles. The kind frontier families wore. Some adult-sized, some children. All fresh. All impossible. Inside the wagon, supplies sat arranged as if the owners had just stepped away. Sacks of flour without mold. Dried beans that should have turned to dust. A Bible open to Psalms, the pages white and crisp. And a journal, leather-bound, sitting on a wooden crate. I shouldn't have touched it, but I did. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1847. Today was October 15th. The handwriting looked rushed. We followed the new marker against Father's judgment. The guide insisted this route would save 3 days, but the sun moves strangely here. Martha says she saw our wagon from the trees, but we're in our wagon. The children won't stop crying about the other family watching us. I tell them it's their imagination, but I see them too. They wear our faces. I flipped pages. The dates jumped randomly. October 16th, October 14th, October 17th, October 15th again. The same day repeated with different entries. The trail splits, but both paths lead to the same clearing. We passed our own graves today. The headstones bore tomorrow's date. The guide is gone. Was there ever a guide? We can't find the way back. Every trail leads deeper. The last entry made my hands shake. A woman came today. Said she was from something called the Park Service. Said she was studying the trail. She looked so familiar. Mother says she has my eyes, but I'm only 12. How could she be my... The entry stopped mid-sentence. I dropped the journal, my hands. I stared at my hands, the silver ring on my right index finger. My grandmother's ring, Mary Thompson's ring, passed down through generations. The Thompson family had made it to Oregon, had children, had descendants. A child giggled behind me. I spun around. Nothing there but trees. Then I saw her, a girl, maybe 12, standing at the forest edge. Period dress, bonnet tied neat, apron clean despite the dusty trail. She wore a silver ring on her right index finger. "You shouldn't have come here," she said with my voice. Not similar to my voice. My exact voice, pitched higher, younger. "Time doesn't work right on this trail. Never has, never will." "You're Mary Thompson?" She tilted her head. I'm nobody yet. Won't be somebody for another 170 years. But you're already somebody. Somebody who shouldn't exist if we don't leave this trail." The ground lurched, not physically, but something deeper, like reality hiccuped. The wagon behind me groaned, and when I looked back, it had aged 50 years in seconds. Canvas rotting, wood splintering, iron rusting in fast-forward decay. "Run," young Mary said. "Run back to your car. Don't look at the other trails. Don't read the markers. And whatever you hear following you, don't turn around." I ran. Branches whipped my face, roots caught my feet, but I ran. Behind me, footsteps, dozens of them, boot prints with square nails keeping pace, but also sneakers, modern hiking boots, bare feet, all following, all in perfect synchronization. The path stretched longer than it should. I'd walked maybe 300 yards in, but I ran for what felt like a mile. The markers kept appearing. Different names, different dates, but all wrong. Henderson Party, 1923. Microsoft Company Retreat, 1847. Sarah's iPhone, Pioneer Cemetery, help us. My lungs burned. The footsteps gained. And voices now, overlapping conversations from different centuries, told you we should have stayed on the main trail. GPS says we're nowhere. Oxen won't move, like they see something we can't. Check your phone. Maybe we have signal here. Cholera took the children. This can't be real. I burst from the tree line. My CRV sat exactly where I'd left it. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking so bad I dropped them twice. The engine started immediately, thank God. But as I reversed, my backup camera showed the view behind. They stood at the forest edge. All of them. Pioneers in homespun cloth. Truckers from the 1970s. A high school hiking club in matching t-shirts. A family in modern REI gear. All watching. All wearing the same expression. Confused, lost, desperate. And behind them, deeper in the shadows, more figures. Hundreds, maybe. All the people who'd found the wrong markers over the years. Young Mary stood in front. She raised her hand, my hand, our hand, and waved goodbye. Or maybe hello, hard to tell with time running in circles. I floored it. Gravel sprayed as I fishtailed onto Interstate 84. Normal traffic surrounded me instantly. Semis heading east, families driving to Portland, ordinary people living in the right year. My phone blinked on. 14 missed calls from my conference coordinator. The clock read 4:17 p.m. I'd only been gone an hour. But my camera... When I checked later, the photos showed nothing but forest. Empty, normal forest. No markers, no wagon, no impossible preservation. The only evidence was dirt on my boots. Dirt that, when tested, dated to 1847. I made it to Portland, gave my presentation on pioneer migration patterns, smiled at the cocktail reception. But that night in my hotel room, I searched. Historical records, old newspapers, missing persons reports. The Barlow Road, the real Barlow Road, had its share of tragedies. But there were other stories. Families who vanished without a trace. Search parties that found wagon tracks leading nowhere. Reports of false trails that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. And modern cases, too. Hikers who insisted they'd found intact pioneer wagons. Truckers who reported covered wagons on the interstate at night. A tech company retreat in 2019 where 3 employees swore they'd met pioneers who knew about smartphones. All dismissed. All explained away. Hallucinations, hoaxes, confusion. But I knew better now. 3 weeks later, back in my office at the Park Service, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like frontier families used to protect valuables, was a journal. The leather binding felt new and old simultaneously. The first page had a note in my handwriting, but I'd never written it. For the next one who finds the marker. Don't follow it. But you will. You always do. We always do. Time is a circle on that trail, and circles have no end. MT. Below that, entries in different hands, different languages even. Spanish from conquistadors, Russian from fur traders, native pictographs I couldn't read, and English entries spanning centuries. The trail calls when October comes. My daughter saw herself as an old woman. The wagon was ours, but we hadn't bought it yet. Follow the real markers only. The false ones lead to the between. I locked the journal in my desk, tried to forget. But October came around again, as October does, and the dreams started. Dreams of that dirt road, of young Mary asking why I left her there, of families trapped between years, unable to move forward or back. Last week I got an email. A colleague found an anomaly near Baker City, a marker that shouldn't exist. Wrong location, wrong date, but absolutely authentic. He wanted my expert opinion. I told him to ignore it, begged him to stay away, but he went anyway. That was 3 days ago. His family's looking for him now. The police found his car at a scenic overlook, engine still running. No sign of him except footprints leading to a path that locals swear wasn't there the day before. I've spent months researching now. The pattern is always the same. October, the Oregon Trail season when desperate families made final pushes before winter. That's when the false markers appear. That's when the wrong trails open. The earliest recorded incident I found was 1844. A Mexican trader's journal mentioned caminos que no deberían existir, roads that shouldn't exist. He described finding Spanish conquistador armor from the 1500s, perfectly preserved, with soldiers who spoke of searching for cities of gold, but finding only the same day repeated. The native tribes knew. Oh, they knew. The Nez Perce called that area the place where time sleeps. The Cayuse had stories of hunters who aged backwards or met their own grandfathers as young men. They marked the danger zones with specific stones, most of which were removed by pioneer road builders who didn't know better. But here's what terrifies me most. The incidents are increasing. 1800s. 3 or 4 per decade. Early 1900s. 2 or 3 per year. 1950s to 1990s. Dozens annually. 2000 to 2020. Hundreds. This year alone. Over 1,000 reported anomalies along the historic Oregon Trail route. Something's breaking down. The barriers between then and now, the false trails are spreading, creating a network of temporal wrongness across the entire trail system, and people keep following them. Hikers, historians, tourists, they see a marker that shouldn't exist and their curiosity wins, just like mine did. The journal in my desk has new entries. I don't remember opening it, but my handwriting fills 3 pages. The trail remembers every journey. Every step taken from Missouri to Oregon lives somewhere in the land's memory. We thought we were conquering the West, but we were creating something else. A recording. A loop. A place where past and present can't untangle. The Oregon Trail isn't just history. It's active. It's hungry. It wants to be traveled again, and again, and again, by everyone who ever was or will be. I met my great-great-great-grandmother yesterday. She's 12. She knows she'll have children someday, but she also knows she's trapped on a trail that goes nowhere. She asked me to help her. But how can I help her when helping her means I'll never be born? The paradox hurts to think about. So I don't. I just mark the false trails on my maps. X after X after X. Don't go here. Don't follow this. Don't. But people will. They always do. I've started driving the road on weekends, looking for new markers, warning people when I can. Most think I'm crazy. Some listen. A few have that look. The look that says they've seen something too. Found a wagon that shouldn't exist. Met a pioneer who knew their name. Last Sunday, near Farewell Bend, I found fresh wagon ruts, deep ones, the kind that take months of traffic to create. But the state park ranger insisted they weren't there the day before. As we stood arguing, a family in an SUV pulled over. The father had his phone out, frowning at the screen. "Excuse me," he called. "My GPS is acting weird. It's showing a road here that... Wait, there it is." I looked where he pointed. A dirt road with a wooden marker. My blood went cold. "Don't," I said. Maybe too sharp, too desperate. "That road doesn't go anywhere good." The father laughed. "It's a shortcut to Ontario. GPS says it'll save us 30 minutes. Your GPS is wrong. That road, it doesn't go to Ontario. Where does it go then?" I wanted to say 1,847. I wanted to say nowhere. I wanted to say to a place where your children will meet themselves and time stops making sense. Instead, I said, "It's dangerous. Washed out, not maintained." The mother looked at the marker, then at me. Something in my expression must have convinced her. "Let's just stay on the interstate, honey." They drove away. Safe. For now. But others don't listen. Can't blame them. If someone told you not to follow a clearly marked historic trail, would you obey? Or would curiosity win? There's a website now. Oregon Trail Anomalies. Run by someone called temporal_tourist_1847. They post photos of false markers, impossible wagons, people in the wrong centuries. The comment section is full of skeptics and believers arguing. But buried in the noise are real accounts, real warnings. "Saw myself at Chimney Rock, older, warned me about something, couldn't hear over the wind. Found a Pioneer wagon with a Samsung charger inside, still in its 2023 packaging. My daughter disappeared for 3 hours on a marked trail near Fort Laramie. Says she lived with a frontier family for 3 months. She knew things. Old songs, butter churning, afraid of smartphones now. Don't follow the markers with fresh cuts in old wood." The between trails are spreading eastward. Saw covered wagons on E70 in Kansas. The government knows something. Has to. Too many reports to ignore. But officially, nothing. Just increased funding for historical preservation along the trail. New rangers at key sites. Digital markers replacing wooden ones. Except the false markers keep appearing anyway. 2 nights ago, everything changed. I was home in Boise, grading papers for the online course I teach. Normal evening. Normal life. Then the doorbell rang at 11 p.m. Young Mary stood on my porch. Still 12. Still wearing her 1847 dress, but her eyes looked older, ancient even. "It's spreading faster," she said, walking past me into my living room like she belonged there, which, in a way, she did. The false trails are connecting. Soon, there won't be a difference between the real trail and the wrong ones. How are you here? This isn't. The trail's 50 miles away. Distance doesn't matter anymore. Time doesn't matter. The trail goes everywhere now. Every road leads back to it if you know how to look. She picked up a photo from my mantle. My family at last year's Christmas. These people won't exist if we can't fix this. Fix what? How do you fix broken time? By choosing. She set down the photo, turned to face me with my own eyes. Every person who's ever found the false trails is stuck, caught between. Hundreds of thousands of us from every era walking the same paths over and over. But we're not really trapped. We're choosing to stay. Why would anyone choose that? Because leaving means accepting the paradox. Accepting that we might cease to exist, or our descendants might, or our ancestors. She pulled out a journal, not the one in my desk, a different one, older. This belonged to the first person who found the false trail. A Nez Perce woman in the winter of 1742. She wrote in pictographs, but the meaning's clear. The trail was always wrong. Even before the pioneers, even before anyone. It's a crack in the world where time leaks through. So, what do? We close it. All of us who've been touched by it. We go back, together, and we choose the right path. The original path. The one that leads to real places in real time. But she hesitated. Not everyone will make it through. Some of us belong to times that can't exist if the trail closes. Some of us are paradoxes that will resolve badly. You mean I might never be born, or I might be born different, or you might not exist to have this conversation. We don't know, can't know. That's why everyone stays in the between. It's safer than choosing. She handed me the journal. Inside, names. Thousands of them, people willing to try, to gather on October 31st, the last day of the traditional trail season, and walk the false paths one final time. To choose reality over the infinite loop. My name was already there, in my handwriting, dated tomorrow. How do I sign something tomorrow? You already did. You will. You are. She moved toward the door. October 31st. Farewell Bend. The marker will say end of trail, beginning of trail. Follow it. We all will. She left. Vanished, really. 1 second on my porch, next second gone. But the journal remained, real, solid, full of impossible names from impossible times. I've been reading it for 2 days. The accounts inside, they're beautiful and terrifying. A Confederate soldier who found Union troops from World War I. A programmer from 2015 who taught binary code to telegraph operators. Children who aged into grandparents during a single wagon ride. Grandparents who became children again. All of them tired. All of them ready to choose. Tomorrow is October 31st. I'm going to Farewell Bend. The rational part of me knows this is insane. But the historian in me understands that sometimes history isn't past. Sometimes it's a living thing that needs tending. And sometimes we're not just studying history. We're part of it, tangled in its loops and paradoxes. If you're reading this, if you found this account online or in a journal or carved into a tree that shouldn't exist, you might be one of us. Someone who's seen the false markers, followed the wrong trails, met yourself in another century. The choice is yours. Stay in the between, safe but cycling forever. Or come to Farewell Bend. Help us close the crack in the world. But I need to warn you, and this is important. Some of us won't survive the choosing. We might fade like the daguerreotypes in museums. Might resolve into people we've never been. Or might simply stop. Young Mary told me the truth before she left. She said, "You know why you study the Oregon Trail, don't you? Why you've dedicated your life to preserving its history." I said I didn't know, just felt called to it. She smiled, sadly, because part of you remembers making the journey. Part of you is still making it. Part of you will always be making it. We're not historians, we're echoes. Echoes trying to find our way back to the original sound. The journal's last entry is different. Different handwriting, different language, but somehow I can read it. The trail ends where it begins. The beginning ends where it trails. Choose the path that leads home, even if home never was. The markers lie, but the truth is worse. We are the markers. We are the trail. We are the choice between what was and what should be. It's signed The First Walker, dated simply Always. I leave this account for whoever finds it. Maybe you're reading it on Reddit, maybe it's carved in wood, maybe it's in a journal that shouldn't exist. Doesn't matter. Time's broken along the Oregon Trail, and we're either going to fix it or accept the breaking. If I don't update this, if this account just ends, you'll know what choice I made. What happened when hundreds of temporal refugees tried to walk out of the between and into the real. Or maybe I'll never have existed to write this. Maybe you'll never exist to read it. Maybe the Oregon Trail will go back to being just history. Just wagon ruts and graves and markers that lead exactly where they claim. God, I hope so. But if you see a marker that shouldn't exist, if you find a trail that leads to the wrong year, if you meet someone who looks exactly like you but shouldn't, don't follow it, or do. The choice was always yours. The trail remembers everything, every journey, every choice, every step from Missouri to Oregon. It remembers the ones who made it and the ones who didn't, the ones who are still traveling, caught between then and now. And somewhere, somewhen, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Thompson is making a choice. Follow the false marker or stay on the real trail. Create a paradox or prevent one. Become my ancestor or never exist at all. I'll know her answer tomorrow, or yesterday, or never. Time doesn't work right on the Oregon Trail. Never has. Never will. Unless we choose to make it right. Farewell, Bend. October 31st. The end of the trail. The beginning of the trail. The choice between. Look for the marker that shouldn't exist. Follow it one last time. Choose. Wait before you go. Before you scroll away or close this screen. I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story. Check the historical records. Check the missing persons reports along Interstate 84. Check the forums where hikers describe impossible encounters. The false trails are real. The temporal fractures are spreading. And every person who reads this, who truly understands it, becomes part of the pattern. You'll start noticing things. Modern cars on roads that lead to 1847. Covered wagons in your rearview mirror. Markers that weren't there yesterday. You're part of this now. Part of the choice we all have to make. October 31st comes every year. Farewell. Bend is always there. The marker appears when it needs to. Some of you will ignore this. Say it's just fiction. Just creative writing. That's fine. Safe. Smart, even. But some of you already know. You've felt time slip. Seen history bleed through. Met someone who shouldn't exist. You know what you need to do. The trail is calling. It always has been. Through every generation, every era, pulling people into its temporal web. We thought we were conquering the West. We were really creating a wound in time. A wound that won't heal until we choose to heal it. Find the marker. Follow the false trail. Make the choice. Or don't. But remember, every time you drive past an Oregon Trail marker, every time you see those wagon ruts preserved in stone, every time October wind carries the sound of oxen that aren't there, remember that somewhere, somewhen, we're all still traveling that trail. Still searching for something that might not exist. Still choosing between the path we know and the path that shouldn't be. The Oregon Trail never ended. It just learned how to hide, waiting for curious souls to find the wrong markers, waiting for you.